And I would say that is the #1 source of engine failure in new tractors. But if you can see there's some fine shavings, metal shavings. We're going to look closely around this front end to see if there's any leaks or any reason why this front end has lost some oil. And usually it's just because those have frozen up over time from lack of grease.
So I came here to do a service on this tractor. I didn't realize I was going to learn so much about the machine itself. I also didn't know I'd get to see an antique John Deere and a classic muscle car in good shape. Hey, it's Brock here from Rock Hill Farms, and today we're going to show you the 50-hour service on this TYM tractor. Try to go through everything that the manual recommends, everything a dealer is going to do when they bring it in. And I've got Jake here, who's the owner of the tractor yard, and he's going to be the expert in this video. We've got an itemized list of all the tools you will need, all of the fluids and filters you'll need, and what they cost.
So a 50-hour service is generally going to consist of changing most, if not all, of your fluids. In our case, we're going to change out front end axle fluid. We're going to change out the hydraulic fluid and filter. And since this is a hydrostat, your hydraulic fluid and your transmission fluid are the same thing. We're also going to do the engine oil filter and some general inspections on the entire tractor, along with grease and a few other things that are recommended by the manufacturer.
And at the end, we're also going to hit the cost of doing this yourself versus what you might pay the dealer.
One of the most overlooked things that really needs to be done on a 50-hour service is just a general inspection. You know, let's visually look around the tractor and see if anything is out of place. Let's check all the fluids and make sure nothing's too high or too low, because any of those things could warrant us looking further into any deficiency like that. So let's first check the front end fluid, just because it's here and convenient. So on this TYM, you've got this plug, which doubles as a dipstick. So pulling this dipstick, I have fluid at the bottom of the dipstick, but we are a little bit low. So that's going to be an item where before we do this fluid change, we're going to look closely around this front end to see if there's any leaks or any reason why this front end has lost some. All right, so since we were a little bit low on fluid on this front end, I'm just looking really carefully around any seal point, anywhere this axle gets bolted together, to see if I see any signs of leakage. And I've looked at the other side, and there's a little bit of a dust accumulation, but nothing that's pointing me in the direction to believe that it has a leak. And it looks like the same on this side. So more than likely, the reason that this is low is you may just have some fluid shifted to the other side of the axle, and it's just giving us kind of a false reading. Or it could have been a little bit low from the factory. It's hard to say. One thing that's important though is that we found that this was a little bit low, so we know going forward to either advise the customer, or you know yourself as the one doing the service, that you need to be monitoring that level going forward so that you don't have an issue crop up in the future. Yeah, so the next thing that I'm going to inspect, just because it's popping out at me, is we want to look really carefully at certain bolts around the tractor. One of the areas that I tell my customers to check, either at the first 10 hours or when they do their 50-hour service especially, is anywhere you see a bolt tying this loader frame to the frame of the tractor. So Brock's got his marked in green, and these are kind of the hot ticket bolts that we see coming loose, and it's not brand specific, it's a common problem.
I had these exact bolts on my John Deere that I had to replace, and half of them were broken.
Yeah, and a lot of it's just general vibration from being used, being fresh paint or powder coat. That paint starts to wear as you use it, and you get a little bit of looseness. So a visual inspection, most of these are going to have a locking washer, and you can see like these are collapsed flat. So without putting a wrench on them, you can visually look and see that these are tight.
I liked on mine, I extended those marks onto the frame whenever I did mine. Mine weren't marked at all, but then I could really see if they'd turned.
Yeah, if you take the time, as soon as you take delivery of the tractor or after you do a service, and mark those across, you can physically see if those have turned.
Yep.
In this case, this is another good way. We're just looking at these lock washers. Another spot that I've seen is just on the subframe where it bolts to the engine block. I've seen a few of those come loose from time to time, and just by looking at these without putting a wrench on them, I'm not seeing anything loose, but it is good to actually get underneath the tractor, and there's a few that aren't visible from just looking at the outside, and all of these are looking good.
And it looks like we've got marks too on the backhoe subframe attachment point.
Yep, so all 3 of these bolts look good.
I figure any bolt that has a mark like that tells you should be paying attention to them.
The other area where you need to inspect, and I usually tell people to inspect these at 10 hours, but 50 hours, if you bring it into us, we're going to be inspecting this also, is all the lugs on all 4 wheels. And same thing, if you're just visually looking at them without putting a wrench on it, you can look at these lock washers and just make sure that they're crushed.
Yep. And I've obviously done a video before talking about the amount of damage that was done to a tractor when a wheel fell off, and there was a big dispute over whose fault that was, how many hours the machine has. Was that John Deere's fault or was that the customer's fault?
Yeah, and it's easy to point fingers, but at the end of the day, it's your equipment and it's your responsibility to know what to look for to prevent you from having the problem in the first place.
Does this machine can you buy wheel spacers for this tractor? I mean, not spacers, weights.
Wheel weights. I don't know of any specific aftermarket weights I could refer you to buy, but it does have
those square holes.
It does have these square holes where you could probably find an aftermarket wheel weight.
Yeah. It's I like having my wheel weights, but they're expensive and it's very hard to check your bolts when you have wheel weights on. I had to get a specialized tool to do that.
So the next thing we'll check is the hydraulic transmission fluid on this tractor. A lot of tractors will have either a dipstick or a sight glass. Some have both. This tractor has a dipstick on the rear axle.
Do you have a preference between the two?
I personally prefer the dipstick just because I think it's easier to distinguish if it's full or not, because sometimes the sight glass, if you don't have a dye in your hydraulic fluid, it's really hard to tell if you're bone dry or if you're completely full.
Yep, I feel the same way.
So same deal, I'm going to wipe that clean, recheck. It's hard to kind of make it out because it's so clear, but we're just below the halfway mark there, and that's a pretty good area considering that you run some hydraulic components like the backhoe that you have on the tractor.
Yeah, anytime you hook up an attachment that has never been used before, you're going to drop your fluid level.
Yeah, so I don't have any specific reason to believe that you would have a leak, but I'm still going to just visually look at some of the more common areas where you would find a leak, especially early on, and that's these rear wheel seals. This axle seal here, that's completely dry.
So kind of a random question, but you sell a lot of tractors and you get a lot of people coming in for service, and what is the most common fail point you find on a newer tractor?
Most common on a new tractor, kind of the general things that we discussed, things to check within that first 10 hours. So loosening bolts, fluid leaks, just simple things generally right out of the factory that your dealer's going to try to catch. You're going to hopefully try to catch within your first 10 hours. But outside of that, maybe a seal leak here or there, just a faulty seal or a faulty assembly process, folding a seal. So like I pointed out, the rear seals there, sometimes these front seals, but mainly those are the most common items that we're going to look for. So the next thing we're going to check is the engine oil, and on this tractor the engine oil dipstick is located close to the engine oil filter, and we're at a good level there. If anything, we're a little bit higher than we need to be, And just by feeling that oil, I can tell that the viscosity is good. Any diesel oil is going to darken up really quickly, so it's not necessarily like checking the oil on your car in a gasoline vehicle where it stays pretty clean for some time. So seeing a dark coloration to your diesel engine oil is not a bad sign at all. One thing too, if you're kind of familiar with the smell of diesel oil, you can actually sniff the dipstick and see if there's any sign of a sweet smell or anything like that, just to see if you have any contamination in that oil. Obviously, another thing you don't want to see is milkiness. So everything looked good on checking that one. So we're gonna slide that back.
We know we don't have any concerns about checking the hood because we've got this deluxe tractor yard grill guard on. So we don't even have to worry about that.
The next thing we're gonna check out is just this area in general. So another thing just to put your hand on a quick check, and this is not necessarily just at the 50-hour service, but anytime you have the hood up, just put your hand on these cables and make sure that they're good and tight on your battery. A loose connection can cause grounding issues and shorts in your tractor, accelerated battery wear. So just a quick, easy thing that you can check anytime you have the hood up. We'll pop the air filter open and just see how well Brock has maintained his air filter.
What is the recommended interval on the air filter? Supposed to clean it every
I guess
day?
What I recommend most people is every couple uses, if you can take a peek at it and just do a simple clean. And doesn't necessarily, you don't have to blow it out, but if you can take this outer element out of the tractor and just knock it out by hand, if you're out in the field and it's dusty, especially, just give it a little dust off every once in a while to help prevent the accumulation.
I'm gonna get your thoughts on this. If you read like a manufacturer's website, a lot of times they'll tell you not to blow those filters out. It damages them and makes them more porous. But personally, I'm probably gonna blow a filter out 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, most people are going to blow a filter out with compressed air. I would say a happy medium for that debate is use compressed air, but try not to blow compressed air directly inside your filter or directly onto the outside of the filter. You know, if you can create a little bit of distance to keep from separating that filter material, that's really the objection to most people cleaning it out.
Does this have 2 filters or 1? Is there an internal and an external?
This
or
one
just
has 2. There's an internal and an external. Typically, the external filter is going to take the brunt of the work, and that internal filter is one that doesn't get changed very often. And for whatever reason, yours doesn't have one.
For me, the rule of thumb is if the internal filter is really dirty, then it's time to replace the external filter and maybe clean it more often. But this is almost a new tractor, and for some reason it did not have an internal filter. So we couldn't really show that. That is a quality control failure at some point along the line, and these things just happen. So we're going to be cleaning out the radiator and this screen and the removable screen. That's a spot where mowing really like brown, dry, tall grass clogs up in a hurry. So you can see that after the last use, I didn't get it all cleaned out.
Yeah, and it's important as a tractor owner to know what all you have here, to keep it clean, to know why to keep it clean, and to sort of come up with your own method of keeping it clean regularly. And it really depends on your use case. So, you know, generally when Brock's using his tractor, if he's moving logs or doing stone work, loader work, he's probably not going to accumulate a bunch of dust and grass in this area. But when he was baling hay, cutting hay, raking hay especially, there's just a lot of material in the air that gets captured. And what all you have here on Brock's tractor, he's got a fuel cooler, an oil cooler for your hydrostatic fluid. He's got a condenser for his air conditioning system, and then behind all that is his radiator. So this is generally normal design for all new tractors, especially cab tractors, to have all of these components packed pretty tightly together. And if you're an owner of older tractors who's buying a new tractor, this is one thing that's actually changed a bit over time, and that's specific change is the design of your radiator. So the radiator on these newer tractors actually have a tighter compaction of fins, and so there's less pass-through surface area. Therefore, you need to be inspecting and cleaning this more often than an older tractor. And I would say that is the #1 source of engine failure in new tractors. It's people not keeping this clean properly, not often enough, and allowing their tractor to run hotter than it needs to. So really important to inspect this on service intervals, and even more important to come up with that method of keeping it clean intermittently.
Yeah, it really seems like having so many other things in front of the radiator is going to reduce the airflow to it.
Yeah, so if you look how this is right now, I mean, you're probably 65-70% blocked in terms of just air pass through to your radiator, if not more. So, you know, the likelihood of you getting this tractor hot under normal conditions is a lot higher. So it's just something that, you know, if you can keep a handheld blower in your cab at all times when you're out doing field work, that's going to help stop periodically and just blow as much of the particles out as you can. And then maybe once or twice during a day's work, pull it up to the shop or wherever you have compressed air, and get in there behind the radiator and actually blow out.
Yep, while I was doing the hay, I was carrying the leaf blower with me, but it would only remove about half of all the buildup because it's not focused, it's not centralized enough. It's putting out a 5-inch tunnel of air. Definitely a compressor would do a better job of it.
Yeah, and there's a product that we'll show that makes this job a lot easier called the Radiator Genie that's easy to get and relatively inexpensive, that I think every tractor owner should have on hand. The last fluid that we're going to check is the engine coolant. So you've got an overflow tank on about every tractor that's going to show you a minimum and maximum level, and you can see that Brock's is just under the minimum line, which isn't really concerning considering it is an overflow tank. The way these are designed, there is a pickup tube here that both passes fluid into the overflow tank and draws from it when needed. So it is important to maintain a good level of coolant in that reservoir, but the true area where you're going to check the level of your coolant is underneath the radiator cap.
And I'm not surprised that the overflow is low because I overheated it a few times, and you're usually going to have some bubble over when you do that.
Right. So Brock's removed his cap, and you can immediately see the level of coolant, which is a good sign. So that coolant you do want to be able to see right there towards the top of the neck.
Is there a service interval where they recommend changing the coolant?
They do. I don't know right offhand what that interval is. I want to think it's close to a 500-hour mark. The biggest thing is you want to make sure when you're doing this service to top off anything that's low at 50 hours, and you want to make sure you're using the correct coolant. So I know with TYM, that was maybe a year ago, they changed from using a typical green coolant that we're used to in the States, a 50-50 mix green, to the red European style of coolant. So you just want to be mindful of what type of coolant your tractor has, and you don't want to mix coolants that are dissimilar.
So for this TYM, we're putting in
the red European style 50-50.
Now usually you go into any parts store and you'll find a bottle that says mixes with any color.
Yeah, so you just want to be cautious not to get a type of coolant that's going to interfere with what you already have in the tractor. So best case scenario, look in your manual, see what type of coolant was used. If you have a question about it, ask your dealer, and they'll be able to recommend the proper coolant to put in.
And That's something that I've decided is, as much as possible, I want to use the exact fluid recommended down to the brand. When I did my oil change on the John Deere last time, some people pointed out that I'd actually used an incompatible oil. And I had heard TYM even has their own oil now, but they've got specific recommendations in the manual for what types of oil to use.
Yeah, and there's a whole separate rabbit hole of conversation we could go down about fluid types and what's compatible, what's not. Just in general, what we use when we do a service is typically not a specific brand, but the engine oil we'll use a 1540. Typically use a Rotella T4. You could do T5, T6, and you can vary that viscosity and weight based upon your climate. How often you're going to be using the tractor. So there's lots of variables there that you can take into consideration, but typically what we're going to use in our area is a 1540 Rotella T4 for the engine oil. We're going to try to match the coolant, and then for the front axle fluid we're going to use an 80 weight 90 gear oil, and for your transmission hydraulic fluid we're going to use any J20C equivalent hydraulic fluid. So the next thing that we're going to inspect before we do any oil fluid changes is just the belt tension. And to be honest with you, I don't normally have a precise way of checking the belt tension, but I'll just put my hand on these belts. You've got two on this tractor, one that's going to run your compressor and one that's going to run around the alternator. And if you've got excessive slop, then you want to be adjusting that. And usually if you have excessive slop, you're going to audibly tell that you have an issue there. You'll hear a screeching. With this tractor, I know by just putting my hand on both these belts that they're tensioned properly and aren't going to cause an issue.
And of course, this is a good time to look for any frayed edges or cuts or nicks in the belt.
So the ring will float up if there's any water mixed in with your fuel. So what that component at the bottom of the fuel filter is it's effectively a fuel water separator. So that plastic dial or that plastic knob at the bottom, you can unscrew with your hand and drain out any water that settles in the bottom. Yeah, periodically you just want to visually look at that float and make sure that it's resting at the bottom. This tractor has two fuel filters, so the one we just looked at was the primary, and this is going to be your secondary. So this filter is actually just a simple metal screen, and honestly most of the time on a 50-hour service we don't even remove that. We can just visually look through this glass and see if there's any particles captured in that metal screen, and in Brock's case it looks exceptionally clean, so we'll just leave that alone for now. And this is one thing, the manual does not on this tractor specifically say that we need to change the fuel filter at 50 hours, but that's one thing. If you take it to us for service, we go ahead and change that primary filter at 50 hours just for added preventative maintenance.
With the general inspection complete, we jumped into fluid changes next, and we're underneath draining out the engine oil right now.
This plate here is part of Brock's backhoe frame that won't be here if you don't buy the tractor with a backhoe or have one installed. So directly above this plate you can see the bottom of these two journals. You've actually got two drain points. The way that this oil pan is built, you have a drain on this side and a drain on this side, so both of those will need to be removed in order to drain all of the engine oil. So looks like a 17 millimeter.
I'll be grading you on the percentage of times you guess the wrench right.
Well, hopefully we get it the first try. There's one. One thing I'm looking at as this oil is draining, I'm looking for excessive particles, metal shavings, and it's normal on this, especially this first 50-hour change, to see a little bit of flake, a little bit of particle. And in this case, I don't see anything excessive, which is a good sign. Also, the same conversation we had earlier about milkiness and smell. you know, what I'm trained, I guess, to smell is right. So I don't smell any coolant or anything like that, no fuel. So everything's a-okay.
So we are right here.
Yeah.
That's 2 plugs but 1 reservoir, right?
2 plugs, 1 reservoir.
But
Yeah.
you recommend pulling both plugs?
Yes, because you'll have some that's just sitting in the bottom of those journals, and you'll get the bulk of it from 1 plug, but as you can see, there's still quite a bit sitting in the bottom of the other side.
See, that's a big distinction that I would have got wrong doing this myself. I would have been like, oh, there's 2 drain plugs. I probably just need to remove 1 of them. But a lot more oil came out from that second plug, too. Sometimes these plugs are magnetic, but we're checking for shavings on the plugs and don't see any on either of them.
Engine oil filter is going to be the next step. We need to remove that. From the factory, a lot of the times it's going to be tougher than after you've serviced it the first time.
Seems like I've heard some conversation online about the TYM filters being hard to get off that first time.
Yeah, they have a monstrosity of a man in the factory just torquing those things to no end. And
well, let's see if you got them bare hands or not.
we'll give it a try.
Take it off with my bare hands.
Yeah, my bare hands ain't doing it, I can already tell. Always seems like it's easier if you get it right on that first turn.
So we got the old oil filter off, and there's a new one. Are you a fan of pre-filling those?
So that's always a hot debated topic, it seems like, on any service video I've ever watched on YouTube, forums everywhere. My personal opinion, my 2 cents, if you will, is typically I don't pre-fill them. The argument to pre-filling them is it's easier on that initial startup where you're not relying on the engine to build oil pressure in order to completely fill that system back up. And, you know, in a lot of cases, I can see the argument. The argument against it usually is that you don't want to pre-fill an oil filter, especially from the inside, which is going to be the portion of the filter that directly feeds the engine. So if you were to pre-fill the oil filter, the smartest way to do it would be to plug off that internal hole, that internal cavity, and fill from the element side. But that takes forever, and I don't think it's beneficial enough to pre-fill it. Typically we're gonna
This even goes on sideways, so you're gonna spill some of it.
Yeah, you're gonna spill some regardless. So we're not going to pre-fill this filter. Be sure to flame me in the comments if you disagree. It helps Brock's algorithm. But we are going to smear a little bit of oil around the sealant ring, which I think everyone agrees that's a good idea.
Absolutely.
So we're going to counter turn so that we don't cross thread. And just spin it back on. Alright, so we've got the engine oil all drained out. Went ahead and swapped filters. So now we're going to go right off this gear case to the engine oil fill point, and it's going to take about a gallon of engine oil.
And one minor detail that you already know is make sure to put your plugs back in, which we've already done.
So another thing I get in the habit of looking at, just because we're looking at tractors that need repairs, I always look at that engine oil fill cap, and if you see signs of milkiness or discoloration, that could be an indicator that you have a head gasket problem. So not something you necessarily need to worry about on a typical service. It's just something I'm in the habit of doing. So like I said, I know this takes about a gallon of
And we're
engine oil.
using a Rotella 15W40.
Yes, we're using the T4. There's several formulas, 4, 5, 6. Especially since this is a low hour unit, the T4 is going to be what we're going to use.
And you said it takes about a gallon?
It takes about a gallon on this model, and I'm going to fill maybe 3/4 of this and just give it a check. Yes, this is just an integrated filter. There's no element to replace, so you're just replacing this entire filter. housing. So it's situated on the right hand side here, close to the oil filter, but just above. And to pull it off, you need a 14mm wrench for socket, and then this is a 7mm to get the hoses to come off.
The big question when you take a fuel filter off is, do you have to prime this, or what's the process like?
Yeah, so this one, you do have to prime it. The process is simple. So on top of your fuel filter element, there's a bleeder screw right here. So you'll just unscrew this about 1.5 turns just to allow fuel to come out the top. And then...
So will the fuel pump continue to run as long as the key's on?
Or yes, the fuel pump runs continuously as long as the key's on, even as the tractor is running. So that's constantly pushing fuel up to your high pressure injection pump, mechanical injection pump. So I've got that hand tight. We should be primed and ready to go.
All right, we'll see if Jake knows his stuff. It should start. And we've got a 12mm wrench on those drain plugs. So a misconception again that I would have had is I would have probably only drained one. Now I might have figured out that you needed to drain two because this part is lower, so you're never going to drain all the fluid out of that side. But there's a third one here, and apparently even though this axle shares fluid all the way across, it doesn't free flow as much as you might think it would. So you really want to drain all 3 service points. It was a 12.
This one was a 14, the side plugs were 12s. A little more than I expected.
So the fact that you can drain the 2 side reservoirs and still have fluid in the middle speaks to your point about checking it from one side doesn't guarantee that's the fluid level if it can hold more fluid in one side as opposed to the other. Another place I would have made a mistake is I would have just filled this from one side because I didn't know. But apparently, if you don't lift it up in the air and spin these wheels, you're not going to equalize the fluid well enough to check it with the dipstick on that side.
So now that we've got the front end lifted a little bit, it's going to make this job easier on us because we don't have to wait for that fluid to equalize. We can actually turn these wheels and assist that fluid in equalizing from left to right. So now we're going to drain the sump for your hydrostatic and hydraulic fluid. I think we mentioned before, but they share the same sump back here at the transmission. So one drain point on this tractor. I think 22 is the winner. All right, we're gonna have to be quick on our feet here a little bit because we're expecting about 8 gallons, 8 to 10 coming out of here.
And how much does that pan hold?
Not enough. I'm going to quickly dump this in our bucket. So on this hydraulic system, you've got 2 filters. And again, this is a hydrostatic tractor. But on this filter here is got the larger pipes coming in and out, so that's how you would know this is a low pressure or a suction filter. On the opposite side of the tractor, there's another hydraulic filter with smaller diameter hoses that's going to be your high pressure filter. The suction filter for the low pressure side and a primary filter for this high pressure side.
Yep, definitely has a lot smaller lines on it. It's turning, but you're kind of crushing it too.
Yeah, that's where, if you can get a good bite the first time, that's going to be your best case scenario. If you start to slip immediately, you're just going to crush and crush on that filter without loosening it, and it just becomes a huge problem. So we've already drained the sump, so we're just expecting a little bit of residual here out of the filter. Slide our new filter back on, and again, I am not going to pre-fill this oil filter. Flame me if you will.
I think they're going to be more upset that you had the channel locks on backward. There it goes.
Teamwork.
Just the way I planned it.
Just the way you planned it. Let's say it's a success. We didn't have to drive a screwdriver through it, beat on it with a chisel, you know. All right, after fighting this primary filter off, we're gonna thread the new one on. This will be the last filter change of this service.
We got a little bit of gunk on the end of that. So is that about normal, or what do you think?
Yeah, so when we pulled the hydraulic fluid drain plug, we found that there was a little bit of, I don't know if it'll focus well or not, but if you can see there's some fine shavings, metal shavings stuck to the magnet. And that's normal, especially from an initial 50-hour service like we're doing. Where you would be alarmed as if there was an extreme amount of chunks sitting on top of this drain plug.
That's more of a mush than a chunks.
Yeah, it's more mushy, just little fine pieces stuck there. So that's exactly what you want to see. That's how we know that the break-in period went well.
I know with the John Deere it was really inconvenient to fill the hydraulic fluid. It's hard to get the funnel down in there, but on top of that, you're trying to hold a 5-gallon bucket. So
yeah, and usually you're fighting the top link or having to remove it or something's in your way. So today we're going to try just this cheap little transfer pump that I picked up from Harbor Freight, and we're going to see if it saves us a headache, or maybe it's a headache in itself. We're just going to give it a go, and maybe it's something that you could invest in to help you save you some time.
How do you guys do it in the shop?
So in the shop we've got a little bit more industrial grade transfer pump. It's a 110 volt plug into the wall, just electric fluid transfer pump, and that's how we pump hydraulic fluid, engine fluid, whatever we need. So definitely more efficient than this, but this should be more efficient in my mind than holding up these 5-gallon buckets.
The only concern I have is if it's too thick. Well, it's not.
It is pumping. It's not necessarily fast, but it is keeping us from having to hoist these things up in front of our face. So this would be something we could almost just walk away and do the next thing, since we've got 5 gallons and a low flow rate. One question we get asked all the time is, I've just done this hydraulic service, now how do I bleed the system? With these tractors, the majority of the tractors on the market today, and most older tractors as well, it's a self-bleeding system. It's self-contained. All you need to do is operate the loader, operate the hydrostat, and it will self-bleed. You may have a little bit of a resistance to flow right at the beginning of lifting the loader or moving the loader, and that's totally normal, just letting that fluid pass through all the filters.
We decided it would be a good time to go ahead and check the hydraulic pressure, because that affects your lift capacity, and you can get a little bit of variation at where they're set from the factory. I've done a video doing this on the John Deere tractor before. I'll put a link for where you can get a gauge like this that just plugs into your loader valve.
And on this specific tractor, it wants to be set at 2,400 RPMs. You're looking at a range between 24 and 2,600 PSI. And you can test it here by just plugging into any of these quick connects for the loader and allow push that function on the loader joystick that corresponds with that hose, and allow that pressure valve to relief. When it basically just hold it all the way one direction, let it relief, read your pressure.
And you can dramatically increase your lift capacity by turning that up. It's a simple adjustment, but this is a machine that I don't think I would want to increase the lift capacity on. It lifts 2,800 pounds on the loader already, and that's a lot. But on a smaller tractor, I've seen guys successfully just increase from the bottom of that range to the top of the range and add a couple hundred pounds of lift.
Yeah, and if you need to adjust this specific tractor, the relief valve is located just off of the loader valve, just in front of it in this case. A lot of the TYM tractors have the relief valve located on the actual loader block itself. So greasing the tractor is something that you should do after every few uses or every few hours. Not everybody subscribes to that same notion, but
yeah, I've greased this dozens of times already.
I think that's the special grease that was in it when it left the lot, actually. But this is something that we definitely do every time we do a 50-hour service, so it's always a good time to just go ahead and squirt a little grease in.
All right, so we've got the loader greased. How many other grease zerks are there on this? And I wonder how many of them are ones that get missed a lot.
Yeah, so I'm not going to point out all the ones on the loader just because they're pretty obvious, but the ones that mostly get missed are actually underneath the tractor. So you've got a couple here where that axle pivots. Usually there's one on the front and one on the rear. Depending on the tractor model you have, you may have one on the tie rods, one on each side. And then the ones that get missed the most are actually where the brake and pedal mechanisms are underneath the cab of the tractor, and they actually pass through the framework, through the castings to the other side. So there's a few under there where I've seen people miss those entirely for the entire ownership of their tractor, and people will come in with complaints that their brakes are dragging, and usually it's just because those have frozen up over time from lack of grease. So those are ones that are definitely easily missed, and we'll get under there and kind of show you where they're at. So first one we'll hit is this easiest one, and it's right here where the brake assembly pivots. It's a little bit of a 45 there.
And this is probably hard to see on camera, but to locate where all of these are, it's straight back from that larger hydraulic filter.
I'll go back through and wipe these clean, but we're just going to locate all these on camera. They're all at pivot points, obviously, where these linkages meet, so sometimes they're going to get caked up and hard to see. But just know on this tractor you've got 4 on one side, and you'll have a couple more on the other.
Now, these probably don't need to be as greased as frequently as the loader.
No, you just don't want to forget about them, because they will freeze up over time and affect your pedal responsiveness, and can also put some drag on your braking system. So like I was saying, there's usually one on each side here. This is right where the four-wheel drive prop shaft goes into the front end.
This is right next to the other hydraulic filter.
And that's the other side of your brake assembly. So on this tractor, the top link does not have a grease point, but this adjustable side link does. So we'll go ahead and get it. One thing we need to do, this preventative maintenance that needs to be done all the time, which we've touched on, is just cleaning this entire assembly here, the radiator, the condenser, and both the oil and fuel cooler. And to do that, we're going to use this Radiator Genie product, which we do sell at our shop, but you can find them on Amazon and plenty of places online. It comes with an air nozzle as well as water, And typically we're going to use that air nozzle more than the water nozzle for cleaning out the tractor. But that water nozzle actually comes in handy for a quick power wash around the house too.
Sweet. Yeah, leaf blower just wasn't doing that for me, that part.
We get people all the time say, well, I've cleaned it out with my leaf blower several times. Why is it still overheating? Well, there's really no comparison between blowing it out with the leaf blower in the field and getting compressed air behind that radiator.
So Jake told me that in his shop, it's about 3 hours to do this maintenance. It's taken us a lot longer because we're filming, but we've got an itemized list here of all the components used in this, and it adds up to quite a lot, more than I expected, honestly. But when you're talking about 10 gallons of a high quality hydraulic fluid, you've got $120 in just the hydraulic fluid. So I'll probably see if I can put a better shot of this on the screen. So when you total up all of the filters, all of the fluids, everything we used, we've got $478 in materials.
Yeah, and typically if you're going to take a tractor to a dealership to perform the 50-hour service, you're going to pay them more than just the material cost. And what we charge at the tractor yard to do a service on this same tractor is about $750. Now that's going to include obviously all of these things that we replaced today, but it's also going to include a few more points of inspection there at the store, and we generally clean the tractor off when we're done with it.
So if I didn't know any of this and I contacted you, I said how much for a service, and you told me $750, I'd say, well, that's BS, that's too much. But when you see just the fluid and the filters adds up to almost $500, it makes sense.
You figure, I mean, we spent nearly a full day working on this, running to the store since we forgot something, which is about par for the course.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about an extra $250 for someone to take care of all that grief for you, who's probably going to notice more things wrong with the tractor than you will.
Yeah.
So.
And then if somebody messes something up, doesn't put enough oil in it, then somebody's responsible.
Somebody else is responsible. So.
Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me and make a video that I hope is helpful to people.
You bet. I hope some of the tips helps somebody do their next service.
I appreciate you guys taking time to watch the video. I'll put links on the screen to more of our videos, and I'll see you next time.